So I'm the chair for this session. I think we have 3 great talks to look forward to. I'm just going to spend a few minutes at the beginning and a few minutes at the end trying to hopefully bring this all together. So I am going to present what I think might be a little bit of a different perspective from the others that we've heard today. I'm looking at the work that we're all doing collectively here at 30,000 foot level. Okay, so we've invested so much time and effort into developing these terrific interventions or theories for behavior change. But really, the million-dollar question is, when I take this to the real world, will this work? And that's something that I've heard in every single panel today. I've heard both, how does this impact behavior in the real world, and will this work in the real world? So those were, quotes throughout the day. So what I want to talk about now is our big challenge. How do we get the right content to the right people at the right time? Okay, so this sounds pretty basic and simple, but it's incredibly complex when you break it down. So first and foremost, clearly what we want to do is develop an intervention that works. Second, ideally, we'd like to be able to tailor that intervention based on individual level characteristics to maximize the impact of that intervention. And then third, we want to be able to facilitate dissemination of that program. So we want to make it available to as many people as possible. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about implementation science. The traditional research pipeline is similar to what you see here. I'm noticing my font is a little bit small. Sorry for those of you in the back of the room. But essentially, within that pipeline, we see the research spectrum. So we begin with our efficacy study, move to effectiveness, then to implementation and dissemination. So scale up and spread the intervention as broadly as possible. So in a nutshell, implementation science is a study of methods to promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. There are a number of barriers that we need to keep in mind when we think about dissemination and implementation. Oftentimes, when we're at the efficacy stage, we develop interventions, not necessarily thinking about the down the line, the amount of resources that would be required to offer those interventions in the real world. So oftentimes we see that our interventions as developed are too resource intensive. It's also really critical to have stakeholder buy-in, and this is even at the front end. So earlier there was a comment about CBPR, community-based participatory research. So this is really the idea of bringing the key players and stakeholders in at the ground stage of development. So if this is an intervention that we'll eventually want to disseminate in a clinic-based setting, maybe bring some nurses into that initial conversation, or even the front desk staff, and understand what the resource barriers, time barriers that they have to deal with, and how we can best weave what we're doing into their practice, as well as even on a higher scale, more of a CEO type buy-in. So someone who can actually champion, who has the power to make decisions within an organization. We also want to be sure, another critical concern is often fidelity. So when we develop these interventions in a highly controlled lab setting, but bringing them out into the real world, it's very easy to have the intervention modified or adapted in ways that may seem relatively harmless, but over time, it may cause concern for limiting the effectiveness of the intervention when fidelity is not sustained. And then finally, we want to think about our setting. So oftentimes a site infrastructure does not allow for the program to be sustained. So instead, what I want to suggest to all of us in the room here is that we think about dissemination capacity at the very beginning, the design stage of our program or intervention. And we also need to consider striking a more reasonable balance, and this goes along with that first point, between internal and external validity. So when we design our studies, maybe use more of a pragmatic trial, where we're not so limited on our inclusion criteria. We're enrolling the types of people with multiple comorbidities, for instance, that we would likely find in the real world. So I want to present to you a framework which I'm sure quite a few of you in the room are familiar with, the Renae framework. I believe I'm a bit biased. I really like this framework, and I've been working closely with the developers for quite a few years. But I think that this is probably one of the strongest frameworks in implementation science. And REAIM stands for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance. Okay, and before I get into the elements of the framework, I just want to make one more important point. And really, at the ground stage of our research development or research design, one of the first questions we naturally ask is, what are our outcomes of interest? Well, typically we're thinking about this from our researcher, with our researcher hat on. So we're interested in using validated measures that are established by the research community to demonstrate whatever health outcome it might be that we're interested in. But there are other players as well that may have different outcomes of interest, and these really do come into play as the research is disseminated. So a program planner or organization may be concerned with cost effectiveness and or compatibility with the priorities of the field. An older adult participant may be interested in seeing meaningful changes in their health status or quality of life. Okay, for sake of time, I'm going to try to really breeze through this, but just to give you a sense of what the REAIM framework stands for, REACH is, we're talking about the number or percent of the target audience. So the representativeness of those people who are exposed to an intervention. So to measure reach, we may take, for instance, if I'm disseminating a program throughout Chicago, I might take the number of people who are engaged in my program, look at their demographic characteristics, and compare those to the census data for that similar area. Effectiveness is very much what we all think of when we naturally conduct our research. Does the intervention work? What's the impact of the intervention? Adoption. This is a setting level factor. And adoption is the percent or representativeness of the settings or staff that are involved in your research. So are we targeting a diverse range of communities? Are we only working with affluent settings who don't have financial barriers? Are we working with across a variety of settings that are able to demonstrate a whole range of characteristics with regard to perhaps their financial viability? Okay, implementation, and this is where we think about essentially those issues that I brought up just a minute ago around fidelity, essentially how the research is, or how the intervention is conducted, and just ensuring that it's delivered consistently as intended, considering the time and cost of the program. And maintenance. Maintenance is something we think about at both the individual and setting level. At the individual level, are the behaviors maintained? At the setting level, is the program sustained over time after our research dollars are gone? Is this something that we've successfully embedded it within the organization? Okay, and just very briefly here, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the social ecological model. I want to bring this up because I think as you listen to the next few talks, you'll see that we are very much concerned about multiple levels of our research. So multiple levels of testing, influence, and outcomes. And I'm going to try to weave in the REAIM framework to help us sort of conceptualize how REAIM can be used to assess our success at multiple levels in conducting our studies. So with that, I am going to hand it over to this